In this video, I'm going to develop the model of a writing style that I introduced in the previous video by looking at 3 examples. I'll start with an overview of the sorts of issues that define a conceptual stance, and then illustrate the model by looking at oratorical styles, prophetic styles, and romantic styles. In the next video, I'll look at 3 other writing styles that are much more relevant to modern academic writing. But I think it's important to see a range of styles to properly appreciate why there's no such thing as a single correct writing style. Let me say up front that there's nothing original in the conception of writing style that I'm talking about here, where a writing style is analyzed in terms of an underlying conceptual stance on a set of fundamental questions. It's a model that has been part of rhetorical theory for a long time. The definitive exposition is in a book by Francis Noel Thomas and Mark Turner, first published in 1994, called Clear and Simple as the Truth. And more recently, it played an important role in Steven Pinker's book, The Sense of Style. If you're interested, I invite you to follow up with either of these books. Our model says that the surface elements of a writing style are derived from an underlying conceptual stance. The conceptual stance describes how the writer orients himself or herself with respect to a set of important foundational questions. The list of elements of the conceptual stance that I have here is taken from Thomas and Turner, but the details don't matter as much as noticing how fundamental the questions are. For example, the first of the elements is the author's attitude toward truth. Is truth objective or subjective? Is it eternal or changing? Is it known through experience or does it transcend experience? Is it equally accessible to the writer and the reader, or does the writer have special access? And so on. I'm not saying that writers who adopt a particular style have self-consciously worked out answers to these questions. What I'm saying is that particular styles presuppose certain answers to these questions, whether the writer is consciously aware of them or not. Now, I'm not going to elaborate on all of these elements. We'll look at examples very shortly. But the gist is that the conceptual stance includes a characterization of the author's audience, the scene that sets the stage for the performance that is about to take place, the members of the cast that define the scene, and a view on how meaning is grounded and communicated between the writer and the audience. The examples we're going to look at are really simplified. If you're interested in a proper scholarly treatment, go check out Thomas and Turner's book. Our first example is oratorical style. This is a style of writing associated with speeches given to an assembly intended to persuade the group to accept a course of action on a particular problem. Greek democracy relied heavily on this mode of public governance, and the rhetorical forms associated with successful oratory were well studied by the Greeks and the Romans. Political speeches throughout history have relied on oratorical methods. An interesting feature of speech in this mode is that because the speaker is trying to mold the audience into one body with one voice and one governing view, the style of speech often has features you associate with music. The speaker will use rhythm and repetition in a way that invites participation and agreement from the audience. This isn't a form that's well suited to complex arguments. The style is more successful when it appeals to common truths and public virtues. This is a very simple example, not terribly relevant to academic writing. But you can see how the context of discourse is what dictates the criteria for success or failure. If a senator in the Greek assembly were to deliver a speech written like an academic term paper, it would fail as a piece of oratorical writing, no matter how good it might be as a piece of academic writing. Let's look at another older form, writing in the prophetic tradition, or what is sometimes called the oracular tradition. Here, the model scene conceives the writer as a prophet or oracle who comes to deliver a message to the community. The prophet sees him or herself as a medium, a conduit, conveying a message whose authority comes from some other source. The writer and the audience are not equals. The writer has special access to a source of wisdom and truth that the audience does not. Old Testament speeches are the classic source for this form, but it's also reflected in almost any kind of writing where the author claims to have special access to an authority. Appeals to tradition, or custom, or common sense, or the wisdom of our forefathers can have this character. The authority doesn't have to have a divine source. Even fashion writers can borrow from this mode, for example, when they claim to know what color or styles will be popular next fall. Here's another writing style. It's sometimes called romantic. In this tradition, the focus is on communicating subjective experience. There isn't a firm distinction between thoughts and feelings and sensations or between the subject and their experience. Writing is viewed as an act of creation that both comes from the self and reveals the self. On the question of knowledge and truth, on this view, the only things that can be known are first-person experiences. In this tradition, Truth can't be conceived analytically or put into language without a loss of definition, because truth is fundamentally something that can only be known through experience. Romantic writing is obviously very far from the conceptual stance we would associate with academic writing, where truth is viewed as objective and accessible to anyone in principle. So, you get the idea. Each of these styles of writing is defined by a model scene where the writer situates him or herself in relation to the text and the audience. When you specify the communication goals defined by the context, the characteristics of the writer, the characteristics of the audience, their relationships to each other, and their relationships to the text, then you've defined the ground rules that determine what would count as successful communication. Oratorical style, prophetic style, and romantic style are very different from one another, but you can still distinguish good and bad writing within each tradition. The same goes for the writing styles we'll be looking at in the next video, which are, as we'll see, much more relevant to academic writing.